It's really, I'm very touched that you've asked me to give this lecture on India at 70, a historian's report card. And I'm going to begin inevitably with Mohandas K. Gandhi, because I've spent my whole life thinking about Gandhi, and I'll spend the rest of my life thinking about Gandhi too. Long before India became independent, in the 1970s, when a popular social movement was gathering ground to deliver this country from alien British rule, a movement under the leadership of Gandhi, Gandhi defined what he meant by Swaraj. And he used the image of a sturdy bed with 4 sturdy bedposts. He said, my image of Swaraj is one which rests on 4 pillars. And these pillars were non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, and Swadeshi or self-reliance. Those were the 4 pillars on which Gandhi expected India's independence to rest on. Non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, abolition of untouchability, and Swadeshi or self-reliance. And I'm going to interpret or gloss Gandhi's 4 pillars as follows. The first pillar, that of non-violence, I'm going to call political democracy, because non-violence in a political system means settling your disagreements through argument and debate. And in this case, through multi-party democracy, where you argue out your ideas before an election, during an election, in between elections, not through the force of arms. Gandhi's great adversary, Winston Churchill, once said, parliamentary democracy is the worst form of governance known to humans, except for all the others. And in a sense, Gandhi's idea of nonviolence, which permeated the Indian consciousness through his ceaseless advocacy of that principle, through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, gave birth to the Indian Constitution. Gandhi may not have approved the Indian Constitution. He was not a member of the Constituent Assembly debates. But one of those ideas behind it was settling disputes in a civil and non-violent form, which in the modern era meant multi-party democracy based on universal adult franchise. So that's non-violence in politics, leads to multi-party democracy. Hindu-Muslim harmony, which is something Gandhi lived and died for, I'm going to gloss as the philosophy of cultural pluralism. That is, a nation is not defined by a single religion, or indeed, in Gandhi's formulation, by a single language, or by a single way of life. It was Gandhi who reconstituted the Indian National Congress as linguistic committees. In the British era, we had administrative units based on rather arbitrary boundaries. So the Madras Presidency had Telugu speakers, Tamil speakers, Kannada speakers, Konkani speakers, Marathi speakers, Malayalam speakers, and so on. Whereas Gandhi constituted the Congress as an alternative to linguistic communities, because every major linguistic community should have, thought Gandhi, the social and political space to express itself. So while Gandhi's work for religious pluralism is widely known, his work for linguistic pluralism and cultural pluralism more generally also deserves to be emphasized. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar, Gandhi called abolition of untouchability. But I'm going to again see it more broadly as social justice, and with 2 core elements to it: the abolition of untouchability and an end to the oppression of women, which was a secondary component of Gandhi's program, but not absent either. We now live in an age of influential and important women political leaders across the world, in our country too, and of course in Germany, in Britain, in the United States. But when Gandhi was active 100 years ago, women were largely invisible in public life. And of all the political leaders of the first half of the 20th century, Gandhi did more to further the progress of women. This may seem somewhat odd, because he did have strange ideas about women. Some of his ideas about the role of women were positively reactionary. On the other hand, he brought women into public life. In a deeply conservative, hidebound society, for women to enter the political movement, to go to jail, to be served food by jailers who were male or of another caste or religion, was truly radical. And by the context of his time, when compared to other political leaders, Mao, Lenin, Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle, Ho Chi Minh, compared to other political leaders of his time, Gandhi did more to bring women into the forefront of public life. So social justice in the Gandhian conception is not just the abolition of untouchability, it's also ensuring gender equality. And finally, when Gandhi speaks of Swadeshi or self-reliance, what he means is two things. Economic betterment through the removal of mass poverty, and of course, the removal also of dependence on foreign nations. India was colonized by a multinational corporation, which later, transformed itself into the British Empire, in which the economic interests of foreign companies were always given precedence over the economic interests of Indian companies. And the ending of mass poverty, giving every Indian citizen a dignified life, security of livelihood, safe housing, education was also part of the Gandhian element. So freedom in Gandhi's conception had four components: political, that is democracy; social, that is pluralism; the social, that is justice; cultural, that is pluralism; and economic, which is removal of mass poverty. These were the ideas that in different ways animated the Indian constitution. It may have taken different directions from the one Gandhi anticipated. Jawaharlal Nehru may have thought mass industrialization under the auspices of the state is a better way to eliminate poverty than will itself renewal. But the idea is essentially a Gandhian one. Now, how far has India met these ideas? What is our report card, or this particular historian's report card, when we look at our country 70 years after independence? And like Gandhi, while answering this question, I'm going to break down the idea of freedom into four parts: political freedom, social freedom, cultural freedom, and economic freedom. And I'm going to give you a report card in each of these four spheres. So, let me begin with political freedom. The time and place in which Indians are most free is when they are alone confronted with a ballot box in which they have to cast their vote. Whether this is a panchayat election, a municipal election, the taluk election, a Vidhan Sabha election, or a Lok Sabha election, this is the time the Indians are most free. There is one exception, which is the Rajya Sabha election, which for various reasons the individuals are not most free, but we can go into that in the Q&A. But otherwise, this is when Indians are most free. Before we go into a voting booth, my wife and I have an argument. And I don't know who the hell she's voted for. And almost certainly it's not the person I voted for. Now, this was not the case actually in 1952. In 1952, when we had our first elections, the women voted as their husbands told them to vote. The Dalits in the village voted as the upper caste landlords in the village told them to vote. Through the 60s and 70s, there was widespread rigging of elections. I mean, I'm old enough to remember how these elections were rigged. In fact, in March 1977, when I was 19 and the age of voting was 21, and this was the first election after the emergency, I was woken up by a college classmate and said, "Ram, come and vote." I said, "I'm too young, I'm not registered." He said, "Doesn't matter, there's a Benami ballot, I know how to get you to vote." And the person who asked me to vote, I said no, not because I was too honest, but because I was too scared, probably. But that gentleman has since served 2 terms in the Rajya Sabha, but that's another story. Now, but that's not true anymore. That's not true anymore. I cannot go and vote as Girish Karnad. No, impossible. Because we have meticulously mapped citizens to their real identity, and there is some amount of error and rigging, but it's utterly marginal. It cannot determine an election. So that's the time Indians are most free. And the holding of regular, free and fair elections is perhaps, in my view, the single greatest achievement of independent India, is that. Now, it's remarkable because it is so counterintuitive. India is the first large, poor, largely illiterate country to embrace universal adult franchise. All across the world, the franchise came in stages, and it's only in countries that had become relatively prosperous and educated that the franchise was given to everyone. In some parts of Switzerland, women were not granted the vote till as late as 1971. So this is our greatest achievement because it goes totally against the grain of history. No one expected it. And to give you a sense of how no one expected it, I'll give you a few quotes. When our first election was held in January, February 1952, the editor of a Madras journal, not the Hindu, I'm happy to say, dismissed this as the biggest gamble in history. The RSS journal organizer said of the 1952 elections that Pandit Nehru, because Jawaharlal Nehru was the person most insistent on universal adult franchise, the RSS journal, the organizer said in 1952, Pandit Nehru will live to confess the failure of universal adult franchise in India. He lived to confess many failures, but not that of universal adult franchise. A former ICS officer, an Englishman, but someone noticeably sympathetic to Indians, who was asked to supervise the polls in Manipur, wrote to his father, "A future and more enlightened age will view with astonishment the absurd farce of recording the votes of millions of illiterate people." And finally, the American ambassador to India in 1952 wrote, and I quote, "A poll of 200 million eligible voters, most of them illiterate, is the biggest farce ever staged in the name of democracy anywhere in the world." Is the biggest farce ever staged in the name of democracy everywhere in the world. So our sustenance of multi-party democracy and of regular and free and fair elections is a colossal achievement. Another key aspect of political freedom is the freedom of movement and association. This too we largely have. Unlike in China, where if you move from your village to a city, you need a permit. You can go anywhere to work, to live. There are some restrictions on owning property in some states and so on, but by and large, the freedom to move, to live, to associate with whom you wish is also guaranteed in practice as well as in theory. But when you talk of political freedom, there is one area in which there is a serious deficit, and that has to do with the freedom of expression. This is a subject on which I have written extensively elsewhere. In my recent book, Democrats and Dissenters, there's a long essay which is called 8 Threats to Freedom of Expression, which outlines how the presence of archaic colonial laws and the rise of identity politics has led to the squeezing of the freedom of expression on writers, artists, filmmakers, and journalists. So that is an area in which we should be worried about. Another blot on our democratic credentials is the arbitrary and often brutal behavior of the police and the paramilitary. The Indian police, particularly in conflict-ridden zones, but not only in conflict-ridden zones, can be harsh, capricious, arbitrary, brutal. Our jails are a blot on any modern civilized society. The lack of accountability of our paramilitary forces in places like Kashmir and Manipur and Nagaland is, I think, again, something we should be seriously worried about. So when it comes to political freedom, we have many substantial achievements, but also areas, freedom of expression and the accountability of the police and the paramilitary being two, where we have to introspect, where we have a long way to go. Let me move now from political freedoms to social freedoms. Historically, the freedom of individuals in India was constrained by many forms of social prejudice, of which two forms were especially ubiquitous and restrictive. And these were, evidently, caste prejudice and gender prejudice. The Hindu social order is the most sophisticated, subtle, and diabolical system ever invented by human beings. You know, Hindus were truly great philosophers because they invented the caste system. In the meticulous way in which they distinguished between individuals, slotted them into compartments, said, this compartment can do this but not do this, can associate with this but not do this, where you can live, whom you can marry, where you can drink your water from, where you cannot drink your water from, is really extraordinarily sophisticated and diabolical. You know, only a true genius, a malevolent genius, could have thought of it. And gender prejudice was equally ubiquitous. The two major religions on the Indian subcontinent, Hinduism and Islam, are shot through by patriarchy and prejudice in their scriptures and in their social life. So the constitution makers, Gandhi and the constitution makers who came after him, had really an uphill battle. The Indian constitution sought to do away with the accumulated burdens of centuries of caste and gender prejudice. This prejudice, I would like to re-emphasize, encoded, substantiated, and enforced both in theory and in practice, both in the scriptures, such as the Quran and in the Manusmriti, and in everyday practice. So, the law abolished untouchability. The law made women equal to men. But the question the historian must ask, 66 years after the Constitution, is, does the practice match up to the law? And the answer, obviously, is not always. If you think at the systematic attacks on Dalits that continue in villages, we recently marked the 10th anniversary of the horrific Herlanji massacre. And in North India, but not only in North India, I mean, Tamil Nadu, southern Tamil Nadu has a horrific record when it comes to atrocities on Dalits. And there's a former correspondent of the Hindu, S. Vishwanathan, who wrote an excellent book on the subject, excellent and disturbing book on the subject. But in other states like Haryana, Punjab, Maharashtra, the birthplace of B.R. Ambedkar, as witnessed recently in the clashes between Marathas and Dalits, the record is rather blemished. There are a few states that have done better. Kerala is a state in which caste inequalities that were once the grossest in India. Kerala, in the early 20th century, Kerala practiced not only untouchability, but unseeability. That there was a category of Dalits whose very sight was polluting to the Nambudri. So if a Nambudri is walking down the road and this Dalit Puliyar is coming that way, he has to shout and go below the road because his sight will pollute. And Kerala is a place in which, over the last 120 years, because of a variety of reasons, of whom the communists are one but only one, they sometimes take all the credit, but that's all right. The Christian missionaries, progressive Maharajas, and maybe above all the great Narayana Guru and his legacy, untouchability in Kerala is at an all-time low. So, the theory is untouchability is abolished. In large parts of India, especially in the countryside, untouchability is practiced. The theory is women are equal to men. The practice, we know, is all too different in a majority of Indian households. In the case of Dalits, the most egregious forms of discrimination and violence are in the countryside. In the case of women, they occur in the countryside and in the cities. But there is progress as well as regression. when you think of a country like India, because of its size, because of its complexity, because human beings are capable of greatly elevated and greatly degraded behavior at the same time, there's always some progress and some regression. So you have all the horrific evidence of continuing discrimination against women and Dalits and violence against women and Dalits that you know of, but you also have on the other side some progress, indeed often substantial progress. What are the features of the India of my life, which is short, a little less than 70, but what are the features, distinctive features, and unfortunately not often remarked features of social life in the India of the last 70 years is the loosening of the link between caste and occupation. You're free to do what your father did, but you don't have to. So, in many cases, and with growing urbanization, your hereditary caste profession does not determine what you do. So you have many examples, shall we say, of Yadavs, who are a traditional herding caste, becoming teachers, which was traditionally a Brahminical preserve. Other instances, exemplified in our city, of Brahmins, who were traditionally teachers and priests, becoming entrepreneurs, which is reserved for Vaishyas. And some much more radical examples of Dalits, becoming teachers, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, and even entrepreneurs, often very successful entrepreneurs. I mean, there is a Dalit Chamber of Commerce, mentored by the very insightful and provocative Dalit intellectual Chandraman Prasad, whose success shows that in some places, not everywhere, but in some places, at some times, among some communities, and by some individuals, there's a loosening of the link between caste and occupation. There's also a loosening of the link, and this is much more relevant to women than it is to Dalits, the link between family and marriage. I mean, probably in this room, there are women of several generations. And it's fair to say that in this room, as in urban India as a whole, the younger you are, the less likely it is that your father can force you to marry the husband he chooses. Right. Now, this is true across. I mean, I could give personal illustrations, and not just the husband he chooses, but what course you study, what profession you take up. In the past, women would not take up professions. My grandmother, who was married at the age of 10, was extraordinarily intelligent and able and articulate woman. She was married at the age of 10. She joined her husband at the age of 14, had her first of 6 children at the age of 16. But read and spoke Tamil, English, and Hindi absolutely fluently, but was a housewife all her life, and a mother and a grandchild. Her only daughter, my mother, was much more fortunate. Something that her mother, my grandmother, never failed to remind either my mother or herself. The letters to my mother from my grandmother would say, and this was an object of some merriment in our family, it would say, Vishalakshi Guha, comma, M.A.B. Ed. And we used to joke about it. You know, my father and I, parties, letters come, and Vishalakshi Guha, M.A.B. Ed, M.A.B. Ed, right? But it's an extraordinary thing. It's because women are not supposed to have a master's or a third degree. And she wants to emphasize that. And even more remarkable than this, and even more demonstrative, in a much more generic sense, of the delinking of the barrier between caste and occupation, caste and education, family and profession, is the story once told by the great Kannada writer Devanur Mahadeva at a conference I was privileged to be part of, as to why Ambedkar is always represented in a suit. You know, Arun Shourie had just written a 600-page book attacking Ambedkar for calling him a British agent and so on. And in the midst of that rather extended polemic, he had made some sarcastic remarks about Ambedkar in a suit. Ambedkar always, why are there so many statues of this false god dressed in a rather garish blue suit? Right. Now, Devadura Mahadeva explained to us upper caste prejudiced men, of whom I was one and Arun Shourie was not there, was another, why Ambedkar always had to be in a suit. This was actually a conference on Gandhi in Manipal. And behind us on the stage was Gandhi in a loincloth. It was the 125th anniversary of Gandhi, the occasion I'm speaking of, 1994. At the end of this conference, Devadura Mahadeva came and said, why do we have Ambedkar in a suit and not in a loincloth? And he explained it as follows. He said, if Ambedkar is wearing a loincloth, you will say, आखिर वो तो हरिजन है और क्या पहनेगा? He is a Dalit, what else will he wear? But Gandhi wearing the loincloth, son of a diwan, upper caste, educated in London, what tyag, what sacrifice. It's precisely because Ambedkar is not supposed to wear a suit that we depict him in a suit. Because education is denied to the Dalit. And here is a man who defied convention, prejudice, orthodoxy, oppression to get 2 PhD degrees, to write the constitution, to become a successful lawyer and law professor and to wear a suit. That's why he must wear a suit. Right. Now, so, women and Dalits, don't mistake me. Women and Dalits are still grievously discriminated against and exploited. But, and this is the historian's judgment, they are probably less unfree now than at any time in the past 5,000 years. We have a great deal more to do. Changing societal forms and organizations and prejudices is slow, patient, hard work. It's arduous work. But some progress has been made. Dalits and women are still grievously exploited and dominated, but arguably, as a citizen, I would like the pace of change to be faster. But as a historian who has the privilege of stepping back one step or more, I would like to remind you that while Dalits and women are grievously discriminated against and exploited, they are arguably less grievously exploited and discriminated against today than at any time in the past 5,000 years. However, when it comes to a third category of Indians, there is no light in the picture, it is all darkness. And this is the Adivasis. Again, I have written about this extensively elsewhere, so I only have to summarize a complex argument in 2 or 3 sentences. But essentially, Adivasis are the one group of Indians, Adivasis of central India, who constitute probably about 80 million Indians. They are the one group who have gained least and lost most from democracy and development in India. They have gained least from democracy because they're not visible in public life. They are Dalit chief ministers, but no Adivasi chief minister. They are Dalit governors, Supreme Court justices, presidents, and so on. Economically, they have been dispossessed. They have suffered a triple resource curse, as their forests, their lands, and their waters have been taken away for industrial and mining projects. And the dispossession was bad enough in the days of state industrialization, and it's even worse in the days of liberalization. So, when it comes to social freedoms, we've made modest incremental progress, not substantial, but modest incremental progress in emancipating women and Dalits, but arguably the Adivasis are even worse off today than they were 70 years ago. So, from political freedom to social freedom, and thirdly, to cultural freedom. As I explained in my introductory remarks, 2 core components of cultural freedom are the freedom to speak and learn in a language of your choice, and the freedom to worship the God or gods of your choice or no God at all. So there are many aspects to cultural freedom, but for simplicity, I will focus on 2. Linguistic freedom or linguistic pluralism and religious pluralism. Our record in the first is excellent. And the sustenance of linguistic pluralism is second only to the sustenance of electoral democracy as independent India's greatest achievement. If you look at the fate of our neighboring countries, Pakistan was created on the basis of religion, but divided on the basis of language, because from Jinnah onwards, West Pakistan insisted to the Bengalis of the East that they speak Urdu. Likewise in Sri Lanka, where there was a bloody civil war, not fully resolved on the question of language, because the dominant Sinhalas imposed their language on the Tamils of the north. If we had imposed Hindi on the whole of India, what would have happened? At the height of the Sri Lankan Civil War, 1956, a visionary Sri Lankan parliamentarian called Colvin D'Souza begged the Prime Minister, Bandaranaike, don't impose Sinhala on the Tamils. And he said, 2 languages, 1 country. 1 language, 2 countries, 2 bleeding countries. In the case of India, it would have been 1 language, 22 different countries. And fortunately, the same year, 56, in which Sinhala was imposed on the Tamils, India created linguistic states. The creation of Karnataka goes back to 1956. And the sustenance of linguistic pluralism is, as I said, second only to the sustenance of multi-party democracy, independent India's greatest achievement. But while our record on the question of language may be very good, our record on the question of religious pluralism is much more mixed. Muslims are freer to practice their faith in India than, for example, Muslims in China. But they suffer disproportionately in times of communal rioting. This is a fact, an objective fact, a depressing fact, that particularly today, in the climate of today, needs to be emphasized. And I speak here as a historian, not as an ideologue. There are 29 states of the Indian Union. In one state, Kashmir, Hindus have suffered disproportionately at times of communal conflict. The forced expulsion of the Pandits remains a blot on Kashmiri democracy. But outside of Kashmir, in every other state, Muslims have suffered disproportionately in times of communal rioting. From the first major communal riots in 1963-64 till today, and there are hundreds of studies, maybe thousands, of serious studies by civil liberties organizations and scholars documenting this. It is an abysmal record when it comes to protecting minorities in times of rioting. In every major riot outside Kashmir, whether it's caused by Muslims or by Hindus, the Muslims suffer disproportionately in terms of loss of lives, burning of homes, attacks on women. This is an objective fact. So, we have let down, among other people, Mahatma Gandhi. In 1947, we became independent, August 1947. In October 1947, Gandhi made an extraordinary speech to the All India Congress Committee, where he said, India is not for Hindus alone. If India is to mean anything, it is that Muslims and Christians and Parsis and Sikhs must have equal rights as Indians. In the same month, October 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to the chief ministers of provinces, and where he said, whatever Pakistan does to its minorities, we must give our minorities equal rights and treat them in a dignified way. We have let them down. We have let down our constitution. Today, there was an excellent op-ed in the Deccan Herald. I think I'm occasionally allowed to mention other newspapers in a talk sponsored by the Hindu, by a person I don't know, an excellent editorial about the boycotting of Muslims in mixed housing colonies in Mumbai. All right. Now, this is for all of you to reflect on. These are objective facts. And outside of Kashmir, I repeat, Kashmir is the singular exception. Everywhere else, Muslims, occasionally Sikhs, as in Delhi in 1984, sometimes Christians, as in Kandahar in 2008, where again in a Hindu-Christian riot, it was the Christians who suffered. Our record is much more mixed. We are not as bad as Pakistan, but that should not give us much pleasure. We should judge ourselves by far higher standards. We certainly don't treat our Muslims and our Christians as badly as Pakistan treats their Hindus and their Christians, but is that how we want to compare ourselves? Or would we rather compare ourselves vis-a-vis the Constitution? So I've spoken of economics, of society, of culture, and I come lastly to the subject I know least about, economics. I have 2 degrees in economics. The last public lecture I gave was at the University of East Anglia 2 weeks ago, where my CV was summarized by the person who introduced me. And he said, you know, Dr. Guha studied economics, and he did not like economics. And when it came to my turn to speak, I said, as a historian, I should set the record straight. It was not that economics did not like, that I did not like economics. Economics did not like me. So I am a failed economist, a second-class economist. So take what I say here with some hesitations and reservations. But still, for what it's worth, I come to the economic sphere and our record in the last 70 years when it comes to economic development, economic freedom, to Gandhi's desire to eliminate mass poverty. How have we done? Now, I think it's fair to say that a large part of the energies of the Indian political class since independence have gone towards claiming that they will remove mass poverty. If you look at the election manifestos, the campaign speeches, the proclamations when in power of all our prime ministers and chief ministers, regardless of party, one of their central claims has been, we are for economic development, for economic growth, for removal of poverty, for all-round betterment, for employment, and so on and so forth. For the first 30 years of independence, economic activity was dominated by the state. As we had what Rajaji famously called the license permit quota Raj. The license permit quota Raj began to be dismantled in 1991, 25 years ago, and many of you have been reading about the anniversary of economic liberalization. And economic liberalization did some very good things. It led to a surge of entrepreneurial energies. Some of the entrepreneurs who are children of economic liberalization, who benefited from economic liberalization and benefited society in turn, are in this room. Bangalore was a showpiece through the IT sector. It led to the rise of new business communities. There's a wonderful book by Harish Damodaran called India's New Capitalists, which shows how through economic liberalization, farming communities became successful capitalists. You know, the Gaudas of Karnataka, the Iravas of Kerala, the Marathas of Maharashtra, the Gaundas of Tamil Nadu. So it led to an expansion of the entrepreneurial class, a culture of daring and risk-taking, rather than really massaging political egos and bribing bureaucrats to get licenses. And it, of course, led to economic growth, impressive rates of economic growth, an end to our chronic foreign exchange crisis, and also a substantial decline in mass poverty. The Indian growth story is largely bright, but it has 2 dark spots. And I'd like to say a little bit about these dark spots. And I'll say more about the second than the first, because I know more about the second than the first. The first dark spot is what has been called jobless growth. That India has grown very fast, but compared to other economies, other so-called emerging economies like China or Vietnam or even Bangladesh, we haven't generated the kind of employment that we should given our growth rates. So we had, what people celebrated as a demographic dividend might become a demographic disaster. And this phenomenon of jobless growth is manifest in, among other things, in the manifold forms of violence that young men undertake. Young men in India between the ages of 18 and 30 are arguably more violent than at any period since independence. And I'm talking about the young men who joined the Bajrang Dal, who joined Simi, who joined the Maoists, who joined Raj Thackeray, who vandalize buses when there's a Kaveri crisis, who sometimes immolate themselves, who attack women. Now, this is a suppressed violence that is in part at least. I think you need deeper sociological analysis of this. But there's a massive amount of violence in the last 20 years, at the same time as you had economic liberalization and greater opportunities, but also greater expectations, and expectations that are often unmet. And the fact that they are unmet are visible to young men. You know, in this city, there is a divide between the north and the west and the south and the east. And often, as in you need a provocation. The death of the great actor Rajkumar was one, where you had violence in the north, in the west, in depressed areas, where you have young men who don't have the jobs that the software engineers in the south and the east have. So jobless growth is a dark spot. This is recognized by the intellectuals, by the economists, by the industrialists, and even by the political class. And the Prime Minister's Make in India is a response really to this phenomenon of jobless growth. But the second dark spot in our story is scarcely recognized, in fact, is sometimes actively suppressed. This is that the Republic of India is an environmental basket case. And I'm not talking climate change here. I don't care if India reneges on all its international obligations on climate change, because the Americans got there before us. And the Chinese will get there before us and after us. They renege more and faster than us. So I don't care. But I care about what we are doing. Our government, our industries, our legal organizations, our institutions are doing to our forests, our water, our air, our mineral resources, our biodiversity, our wildlife, all of which is impacting our lives at an everyday level. There's a false and pernicious myth, first promoted by ignorant economists, and then furthered by malevolent industrialists, that India is too poor to be environment, that you must first grow rich and then clean up. This is a false and pernicious myth, because as documented many, many years ago by two of India's greatest scientists, both who worked in this city, Amulya Kumar N. Reddy and Madhav Gadgil, environmentalism in India is really a problem of the poor. That our abuse of natural resources, the way we have devastated our forests, polluted our rivers, depleted our aquifers, thrown chemical toxic substances into the soil, have had an impact on farmers, pastoralists, fisher folk, artisans, on poor ordinary people. Even air pollution, which is the one thing the urban upper class recognizes, because even their children are on steroid inhalers. Even that affects the poor worse because of the fact that they have poor nutritional and housing standards. Environmental responsibility is the only way India can grow. And this truth has been cynically, as I said, the economists were simply ignorant. Because as the great Berkeley economist George Akerlof, a dissenter within his profession, once said, if you show an economist something that works in practice, he will answer, all right, but does it work in theory? Because economic theory tells you that there's a Kuznets curve, what is called an environmental Kuznets curve. First you grow rich, then you clean up. But in practice, every day around you, that's totally wrong and false and pernicious. I started by quoting Gandhi, and I think I should give you at least one more Gandhi quote before I finish, though I have some time to finish. And that's to do with the environment. In 1928, Gandhi said, God forbid that India industrialize after the manner of the West. Let me put it. God forbid that India industrialize after the manner of the West. And then he continued, the economic imperialism of a tiny island kingdom, namely England, is today, namely 1928, keeping the world in chains. And then he said, continued, if a country of 300 million, which is what India was then, took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. Now the key line, or the key phrase in this Gandhi quote, it's a little known Gandhi quote, the key line is, God forbid that India take to industrialization after the manner of the West. Take to industrialization, take to development, find ways of removing mass poverty, but not after the manner of the West, because the economic growth of the West depended on imperialism, on the control of colonies. And if India, or you add China, took to similar economic exploitation, not recognizing the resource constraints of their own societies and the much larger population densities of their own countries, they would strip the world bare like locusts. And this knowledge has been known to us for the last 35 years, to our scientific communities. It's been there, but it has been systematically scorned by the economists and deliberately suppressed by the political class. And I think this is a major, major challenge facing us. Economists have woken up belatedly, or some of them, fortunately, unfortunately not the most. John Maynard Keynes once said, every political leader is hostage to the defunct ideas of a long-dead economist. All right. Now, there are some outstanding environmental economists in this country, but I don't think our political leaders listen to them. For those of you who want to follow this up, when the election campaign for 2013-2014 was gathering steam, two famous Indian economists published books, Amartya Sen and Jagdish Bhagwati. And Amartya Sen was for kind of the state playing a more active role, Jagdish Bhagwati was free market, and they went hammer at tongs at each other, which is an old story. It's Lodha versus the BCCI, sort of. And people, the commentators took sides. Is Sen more right or is Bhagwati more right? And the most perceptive review was by a third Indian expatriate economist, Partho Dasgupta, who reviewed both their books in prospect and pointed out that both were wrong because neither recognized the profound environmental damage that economic development, both under state and market auspices, was already doing. An economist called Muthukumar Mani did a study. It's called Greening the Indian Economy, and he showed how the fact that our economic development is so environmentally destructive is actually shaving. If it was to become more responsible, it would increase our GDP by 3%. So far from reducing GDP, environmental responsibility will actually assure higher sustained growth. There are many examples of this. There are young people in this audience. I'd like you to follow it up. You read Partho Dasgupta's article, but also follow the writings of the two great Bangalore scientists I mentioned, A.K.N. Reddy and Madhav Gadgil. There's a whole website devoted to the writings of A.K.N. Reddy on energy policy, and Madhav Gadgil's writings on forest and diversity will always be available. And you'll get a sense of how this is a deep and dark spot in our economic growth story. Now, I've given you a kind of historian's analysis of how we have done in our nearly 70 years as an independent nation. When we were born, before I was born, India, I'm younger than India, not by much, but still. When India was born in August 1947, amidst the carnage of partition, with 500 princely states yet to be integrated, against a background of scarcity, refugees, famine, a world war just ended, few experts expected us to survive as an independent nation. A year after Indian independence, a former general who had served in India for many years and liked Indians, Claude Auchinleck, wrote, I quote, this quote is from 1948, and Claude Auchinleck is writing, in a private letter to an Indian friend he's writing, the Sikhs will set up a separate regime. That will be the start of a general decentralization and breakup of the idea that India is a country, whereas India is actually a subcontinent as varied as Europe. The Punjabi is as different from a Madrasi as a Scot is from an Italian. The British tried to consolidate it, but achieved nothing permanent. No one can make a nation out of a continent of so many nations. Now, while I was writing my book, India After Gandhi, in the late 90s and the early 20th century, 21st century, I came across many such predictions. Any number of Western writers, and sometimes Indian writers, wrote us off. You know, we wouldn't survive, we'd balkanize, we'd become an authoritarian state. And one second, let me. And I was writing this book, or researching this book, and reading these prophecies. In the 40s, Auchinleck. In the 50s, biggest gamble in history. In the 60s, scarcity, and we're going to have 50 million people die through mass famine. Then the emergency. Democratic India is gone. Then the demolition of the Babri Masjid. India is going to become a Hindu theocratic state. So I was reading these things, and then they stopped coming, and India was growing, and we were becoming confident. And I was reading something in the archives, which is, India is sinking. That's what the archives were telling me. And the newspapers were telling me India is shining. And I was being told that India is going to become a superpower. They were convinced, some of my closest friends. And people I really admire were convinced. And I would say, yes, yes, yes. It's a biological truism that diversity leads to growth. And China will collapse, India will surge ahead. And the only thing is, what do we do when we become the great power? We must not be like Europe. We must be a benign imperial power. After all, we have to remember Gandhiji and Nehru, right? Now, I was reading this in the archives. India is sinking. And my friends around me are telling me, India is shining. But these were friends living in Electronic City, right? They hadn't gone to North Bangalore, not gone to rural Bangalore, let alone Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, where I had been. So I said, kuch dal mein kala hai. India is not shining because I've traveled enough around India to see India is not shining. But India is not sinking because I'm here and voting and talking and debating. Either, right? So, that we survive still is a miracle. And that we are a democracy, even more so. We have falsified the pundits who said we'll break up, but we have still much more work ahead of us. India is, as a nation state, India has largely succeeded. When I was writing India after Gandhi, confused by these mixed signals from my friends and from past commentators, I said somewhat cautiously in between, I said that as a multilingual, multi-religious political unit, I said that as a multilingual, multi-religious political unit, the Republic of India anticipated the European Union by 40 years. Now I think I can say that we'll outlive the European Union by at least 40 years as well. So, as a nation state, we are largely a success. We have problems in Kashmir, in Manipur, in some of the Naxalite areas. But historically, every nation state has had these serious problems. In fact, we've done much better. America, 90 years after its founding, had a bloody civil war in which 1 million people died. The Soviet Union, which, like America and ours, was a multicultural, multi-religious political unit, collapsed in 70 years. So I would say, as a nation state, India is 80% successful, but as a democracy, perhaps only 50%. My worry is that we are becoming what I have termed an elections-only democracy. We are not so much an electoral democracy as an elections-only democracy. You win an election and you think you're immune from criticism for the next 5 years. That was true of the UPA. That was true of the NDA. That was true of Jayalalitha. That is true of Siddaramaiah. That is true or truer or truest of Mamta and XYZ. Right. Now, but democracy is about continuous reflection, interrogation. Not just in parliament, not just in the media, but in reflection, in activism, in scholarship, in civil society work. Look at the suppression of civil society that's going on now. We are becoming an election-only democracy. This is reflected our failures in between elections. Our elections are free and fair. That's the time we are freest. But in between elections, the deficiencies of our democracy are manifest in the widespread corruption and criminality of our political class, the deterioration of our public institutions, as witnessed particularly in our shocking failures in providing education and quality education and health to our citizens, the collapse of the criminal justice system. 70 years after independence, we Indians are more free, perhaps much more free, than when the British left our shores. But we are less free, perhaps much less free, than what the framers of our Constitution hoped us to be. Our political freedoms, our economic freedoms, our social freedoms, our cultural freedoms are all constrained in small and large ways. Much work lies ahead of us. Thank you.